Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third installment of the NGO Industry Day. This afternoon, we're happy to have Dr. Douglas Gladden be joining, or Glandon joining us for this talk about his career and the things that he's done and stuff like that. And I would like to just quickly talk through some of the plan for what we're going to do. Is that I have some prepared questions that we're going to go through, along with using some time at the end for you to be able to ask your questions. But if you do have a question that kind of comes up timely in terms of when we're talking or anything like that, please put your information into the chat, or raise your hand. I'll be sure to call on you as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. Let me just start the slide deck. So I'd like for you to, if you could, just to tell us a little bit about yourself and about the current work that you're doing at the International Initiative for Education, for Evaluation, sorry.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the invitation. And thanks, everyone, for joining. I hope this is useful. So my background, academic training and professional work is in international development broadly, but global public health more specifically, particularly in policy, research, and evaluation. My current work at 3IE, International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, is sort of there are two main areas. There's like the technical work, which is in the generation and synthesis of evidence related to development interventions. So this includes impact evaluations, right, systematic review.
Working for.
Pardon?
I think somebody just unmuted by accident. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, no worries. So impact evaluations, systematic reviews, and evidence mapping, which is basically a systematic search of the literature to figure out for which types of interventions and for which types of outcomes impact evaluations or rigorous evidence exists on whether or not an intervention works. So a combination of those things, mostly leading portfolios of work in those areas, including with USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, and other funders. And another role I have at 3IE is as our leader of methods development. And in that role, my job is to keep us up to date on new or innovative data sources or approaches to generating evidence that are relevant. So a big one includes big data and artificial intelligence. Most directly relevant for impact evaluation are things like remote sensing and Earth observation. So whatever we can glean from satellites to bring in data on covariates or outcome variables that we can bring into our analysis. Other types of artificial intelligence approaches can be very useful in like covariate selection for regression models, or looking at treatment effect heterogeneity. So you can go beyond just your simple subgroup analysis, and you're not as subject to the limitations to power from sample size every time you increase the number of covariates you want to look at, or subgroups you want to look at. Another area of this sort of methods development is pushing the boundaries for more systematic and high quality inclusion of cost data in our evaluations, so that when we're producing an effect estimate of, if this worked, it achieved this effect, we can also say at what cost, because policymakers need to know whether it's cost effective, not just effective. Additionally, given sort of a strong emphasis toward adaptive approaches in the development space broadly, we are bringing in adaptive management type approaches or responsive approaches to generating evidence. And I could get into that if people are interested. So that, in a nutshell, is what I've been working on.
Great. Thank you so much. So could you share the kind of details about how you determine your career path and kind of to be where you're at?
Sure. So I was interested in public health at a relatively early age. My dad was a county public health official in Michigan, and talking with me about asking questions about, like, why are some people healthier than others, and what are the reasons why there are differences between groups, and what makes people healthy, and all that stuff from a young age. So I had that interest in public health. And I also had a strong interest in just learning about other parts of the world and how things were different. So I went into college with this sort of combination of international relations and then public health. And so that sort of made sense. And it was an early start. But at the time, like in college, I also wanted to be a doctor. So I did all the pre-med courses, like the 4 years of all the pre-med. I did all the right internships, from working in like a pediatrics practice in Michigan to a peri-urban health post in Senegal. And it wasn't until 2 weeks right before the MCAT exams that I realized that I actually am more interested in systems and policy questions than seeing patients. So I kind of dropped that whole med school plan about just before those exams. Then I went into after my master's, I went into the workforce for 10 years, and I was thinking I would never want to get a PhD because I didn't want to have to fight for defending intellectual turf around and have a strong requirement to just like publish or perish. But my time working actually made me realize that I wanted to come back to get a PhD, and that's what brought me to Hopkins. And actually, it was time I spent as an embedded advisor for monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning in Fiji, so in the Ministry of Health of Fiji, that made me realize that I want to make sure that when the windows of opportunity for influencing policy decisions arise, that I wanted to be prepared with the best set of methodological approaches to recommend. So that's what brought me to Hopkins. So I think in a nutshell, part of it, like the global public health part, started early on, but how I pursued that in terms of degrees was not planned and kind of came somewhat unexpectedly unexpectedly, just kind of was emergent.
Yeah. Well, so I think it's a rarity that I've heard that there are somebody that becomes interested in public health from a family member, because I think a lot of times it's you don't hear that very often. So that's refreshing to hear. But I also think it's very true that the path that people go into, whatever area of public health they go into, is not really ever kind of planned. I always say public health is a nonlinear career path, and there's, you're never really kind of, intentional with what you're doing, or you think that you're going to go in one direction, and you certainly did. You thought you were going to take the MCAT and then decided not to. So that's usually pretty often what I hear a lot of times as well. So I think it's very true. So okay, so let's see. In terms of the it's like when we think about the working within the NGO industry or the global health industry, oftentimes there are challenges, some that may be in your control, maybe out of your control, but maybe could you identify what some of the things you found to be difficult, and then how did you go about kind of navigating some of those obstacles or challenges that you had?
Sure. Well, one thing I would say is that in my professional work, I have worked for an organization that was for profit, doing international development, like global health work, and now an NGO. And I think that of those organizations that are either for-profit or NGOs in the global health space, there are a lot of similarities, or I experienced a lot of similarities in terms of type of work, the work environment. So I didn't see them as wholly different in that respect. But one thing that is fairly a notable challenge on the NGO side is the fact that we have this, and I'm thinking about my current organization, we have a strong mission orientation to produce global public goods to share with the world. And yet many donors are not particularly interested in producing global public goods. So there's a strong interest in producing private goods. So like, do this piece of research for this particular project, which will benefit this project and this set of stakeholders. And if it so happens that the production of that is beneficial to other people, then great. So trying to get funding for generating global public goods can be challenging, especially when foreign assistance, international development funding is diminishing in some cases. So how do we deal with that? One of the things that we try to do is, instead of talking to funders as just funders, we try to approach those conversations and engage them as evidence partners. It's a very kind of frank conversation. And oftentimes we find that there's openness to talk about things like, we would like the outcomes or the outputs of this work to be beneficial to the world in general, and not just focused on the specific needs of this project. And that has resulted in, that kind of upfront negotiation has actually resulted in some changes of scope. And I'm thinking of a recent evidence map that we produced with USAID, where the scope and focus and our whole framework was expanded to be built around the global way of framing and thinking about a particular topic, rather than just like how it was structured within USAID. And the output of that is available on the website for everyone, and will continue to be. So that's one thing, is just actually stating that as a mission in conversation with funders. It's not always a possibility, but you might be surprised. And I think the other thing is trying to always keep an eye out for funders, philanthropies, donors that have an interest in contributing to those kinds of global public goods, and doing that networking, chatting with them and showing them what we can actually offer, to see if they might be interested. So that's the low percentage likelihood, but it can work, and sometimes it pays off.
Yeah.
We recently got funding from Mackenzie Scott. So Bezos's ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, has a large philanthropy. She wants to give her wealth away, and supported our organization, among others, to help with things like this.
Got it. So that's going to lead actually in somewhat, I think, to my next question. So the next question is like, what are the skills and knowledge that you learned at Bloomberg that have been the most useful in your career? And my little add-on to this too would be, what are the skills that you had to learn that you weren't expecting you needed to do? So like, I think of the example that you talked about there with the funders, and trying to get them to think a little, the private funders having them think a little bit differently. But do you think it's just a skill that you learn from doing it on the job, or do you think it's maybe things that maybe picked up along the way while studying at Bloomberg?
So I would say definitely a combination. A lot of the stuff gets picked up on the job for sure,
Yeah.
As with any profession. But there was a lot of useful stuff from Bloomberg as well. And I was in the School of Public Health in the Health Systems program. So everybody's focus is going to be different depending on where they are. But for me, I found firstly that the broad range of methodological skills was very valuable, and even thinking about the epistemological foundations. How do we generate knowledge? What is knowable, and what is the basis? Whether using quantitative or qualitative data, what are the bases for determining whether you can know something? And is it something like truth is an objective reality that exists out there, and all you have to do is measure it properly, or is it subjective and a product of the relationship between observer and observed? I mean, those are philosophical fundamental questions that we dug into in some research courses at Hopkins, and I really appreciated that. And I found that a lot of people that I interact with professionally don't have that background, but it's very helpful in navigating a lot of the different methods that people talk about. So I found that very helpful. And then in addition to just that sort of broad-based sort of methodological training at Bloomberg, I thought that the courses in systems thinking tools and approaches were quite helpful. Policy analysis, causal inference, and that policy analysis one, just pick up on overlaps with the question you asked, which is, how did you figure out how to interact with funders and negotiate, generating a global public good out of what otherwise would be a more narrowly targeted contract scope. And the policy analysis course brings in theoretical frameworks and a way of thinking about the kind of the political decision space for different kinds of actors. And so anyway, I just found it useful.
Yeah, and I think about too, and kind of thinking about the students in terms of what they're learning and things like that. It's almost like the training that you get at Bloomberg just gets you to think about things in a different way. Like it's a way of thinking that is taught through the material or through the professors or even the alumni like yourself that are doing the work. It just gets everybody to kind of think about it in a different way. And I don't think it's like theoretically when you're in the classroom kind of doing it, you don't see the practical application of it until you actually get out into the field and start doing that type of work. So, but I think you recognize it after you're kind of into the field. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just to add on to that, I think the foundational work, I would also add mixed methods, which is a follow-on. Like, I really appreciated one like mixed methods seminar at Bloomberg, in which I kind of learned that mixed methods is not just doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's fully understanding and applying all the rigor for, let's say, a quantitative element or strand, fully applying the kind of the theory and rigor of a qualitative strand, and the third bit, which is the mixing part, which is like a discipline and practice on its own. It was like thinking about it as 3 times the work, and thus often necessitating a multidisciplinary team of people was a really important way of thinking. And just like you said, it informed how I approached research projects and trying to find its team members, for instance.
Yeah. And I don't even know if it's like a skill that students realize that they're using until they're actually kind of using it and not seeing that it's there. It's it's like well, if I'm going to do it, I need this and I need this and I need this. Well, maybe it's not one person doing it, but like you say, it's a team of folks that are doing it as well. So okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea that so a lot of times when students are interested in wanting to go and work with NGOs, a requirement is in-country experience. And that's a lot of times difficult to do. And like a thing I've heard a lot before is to say, well, if you want to work internationally, you need to have international experience. But I guess the advice would be is how do students get their foot in the door or find a way to get entry level in-country experience or look for those opportunities? What would your advice be?
Sure. Well, I would say there are actually multiple different things you could do that can be helpful. So it's no single thing, but one thing that could be helpful is if you are speaking other languages, like you're speaking French and you know of an organization that's doing work in, Francophone West Africa or something, that could be quite helpful. They might need extra people to support. So language might be a quick way to make yourself more attractive for that kind of opportunity. And that actually was the case for me when I was on the job market right at the financial crisis in end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And speaking French was very attractive to an employer that hired me at the time. And I immediately started traveling and then was like out of the country 60% of the time for multiple years. So that was a pathway for me, but there are other pathways I've seen other people follow that seem quite effective. So one thing that I see people do is to just do a lot of informational interviews with organizations that have relevant work and talk to people at different levels, including at the level of the position they are applying to ask them, what is this position like? What's your experience? And to do that with multiple people so that by the time, one, it can help them get an extra internal referral. So, their name gets passed along to the hiring manager. And then by the time they get to an interview, they have so much more information about the organization and what the role is that hopefully they would have solidified that that's something they're interested in doing. And then they just come across as more informed during the interviews. That's super helpful. I saw a question like, how do you get informational interviews? I've just seen people cold email or cold Facebook or not Facebook, sorry, LinkedIn message people, whether it's me or others in the organization, and people often respond. So I wouldn't hesitate. I would also say that it can be very helpful if you have an opportunity to shape a research project that you're doing, and you already know what type of NGO you might want to be working in or topical area, and sort of frame your research project around something that will match well with the type of work that NGO does. And then once you finish that, to talk with them and just mention that research project, try to frame it around what that organization's mission is, can be quite helpful.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times research projects are actually two good introductions or good representations of the ability and skills that a student has to be able to work on something. So while that project may not be precisely the exact match, it can certainly serve as a good introduction to say, here's what I have the ability to be able to do. And then just, then seeing how it could fit into the mission of the organization as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I would say also it's very helpful for entry-level type roles in many of the organizations that I know of. It's often helpful if staff at that level are willing and flexible or express a flexibility to do a variety of kinds of work. Like, I'm willing and able to help out with project management stuff in addition to doing technical work. Sometimes people are not selected for roles if they say, I only want to work on this kind of research. period. So I expect that, you know, you will make this available for me. Like that's not really what many NGOs are looking for.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I remember an alum once saying that when she was looking for work, she would, as part of the information interview, she would say, what is your biggest like project or challenge or thing you can't work on? And then they would say and then she would be like, is that something I can help you out with? Or she would say, like, what is your bare like what is your just thorn in your side thing that you can't do? Or what is your most, pain point project that you're kind of working on? Can I take a crack at it for you? And part of what you do with that is you build a kind of win-win kind of mentality, which is it becomes a win for you as a student because you're gaining some experience, and maybe it becomes a win for them because they're getting something done, and then that could maybe lead to consideration for a job somewhere down the road as well. Cool.
yeah, absolutely. Seeing a question up in the chat here. I'm not sure if I missed any of these.
Nope, you're good.
Okay, so do you think fieldwork experience in global health is always necessary before starting professional work? No, I have colleagues who have not had fieldwork experience who come and join and then are quite effective, and then through the organization get the fieldwork experience. So I don't think that's essential. It's helpful, but not essential. I think many times organizations are just looking for people who are going to come in and be helpful and be good colleagues and be willing to learn, show that you're coming in with the right attitude, solid skill set, readiness to learn. And that's a lot. That's a lot. It's very.
Yeah. And that's hard to kind of portray too, like in a resume or in a cover letter. And that's why I think the information interviewing is, so valuable, because it gives that opportunity to express those things that you're willing to do, for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Going on to one of my, oh yeah, skip one. Hold on. Let me go back over. So from your experiences, and kind of your kind of insight about the field, like where do you see things maybe going in the future? And then what would be some things that students should, be considering and preparing for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would say one of them is what one might call sort of localization agenda in international development or global health. And that is a loose term that I think encompasses multiple sort of related concepts. One of which is a desire on the part of major development agencies, including USAID, but others, to direct more or larger proportion of their funding to organizations that are based in low and middle income countries. So that includes for research work, for implementation work, but basically get the funding to the place where people are doing work in the area where policy change is happening or the need is being addressed. So there's that, almost like where's the money going part of localization. Then there's another related theme, which is like democratization of evidence, which is broadly about trying to engage with and empower and bring in local voices and perspectives more fully into the research or evidence generating process, all the way through, from figuring out what the research questions should be, what actually constitutes information on whether something is working or not working, what the implications might be, and so forth. So that democratization of evidence is another part. And then the sort of decolonization of development, or decolonizing development or aid, is related to that, of the general idea that global health, international health has this historical past of basically being administered by countries in the global north or the west to minimize or reduce infectious disease in low and middle income countries, and therefore there was this kind of Western experts analyzing things and deciding, and then managing epidemics by swooping in and deciding what needs to happen, right? So there's that legacy of that still kind of needs to be unwound. So all of that kind of fits within localization. I think there's more effort to and more momentum around doing that. So that's one theme that I see as continuing that students should be thinking about. Another is, as I sort of alluded to in the work I'm currently doing at 3IE, the role of big data, data science, artificial intelligence in shaping the data and evidence landscape. There's so much more evidence or data, I should say, that can be brought to bear into analytical questions that we can't really afford to ignore it. And yet there are lots of questions about how best to do it without bringing in additional bias and without exacerbating the digital divide between people who have access to the data or can afford the data or have the skills. So that's a big one. One thing that we talk about on that front in our organization and with some of our partners is the concept of geospatial literacy. Basically for social science research in general, the message is that we cannot afford to be geospatially illiterate, because for many types of interventions and programs, the sort of temporal and spatial aspect of where and how something is being done cannot be ignored. And so understanding how to gather and bring in geospatial data into an analysis is very important. And then the third area I would say, as where there will be an increasing need, or there's a current direction, is in the push in many development organizations for more adaptive type approaches to programming. So this is differentiated from more traditional approaches where you would say, all right, we're going to design a program, have a budget, and have an implementation plan and monitoring evaluation plan. And then we're going to do the same thing for 3 years or 5 years. And then we're going to figure out if it's working or not. There's more of a push to saying, you know what, we can't predict fully whether it's going to work. And we don't want to wait 5 years to find out whether or not it worked. So we're going to start and then iterate and adapt. And so I would recommend that people just update themselves on the various adaptive management approaches and sort of complementary type tools that can help with operating in a complex environment. So complexity, systems thinking stuff. And just on the localization thing, like a practical, that's a big broad one. So I think the only advice I would maybe give on that is, when you're thinking about which organization you might want to work for, just learn about, or try to learn about, or ask about how they think about localization and approach it, and see if that resonates with what you think. Does it make sense to you? Like, are they thinking about it or not? Because if they're really on top of it and kind of forward thinking about how to do it, that would be a good place to contribute and learn.
Would you say something like an organization like that is it's one to where things are going to be very kind of fast moving, almost like it's a consulting firm? Like consulting companies usually are, they do one thing, go on to the next thing, or they're changing, based on what their clients are kind of looking for. Do you think that that's kind of like the culture, like the move to what the culture may look like?
Oh, I see. Like, will there be a shift to like trend following, in terms of like following the money? Is that what you're saying?
Well, No, I guess what you were saying in terms of the understand, like being adaptive and being, when you said that, I kind of thought about like being nimble, like being able to kind of, you know, see, understand what the needs are of the wherever that NGO is working, and then just kind of knowing how it is that you can, that anybody that works for that organization, can kind of fit, adapt what they want to do and how they want to do it based on the who it is that they're serving and things like that. So I guess consulting isn't the right kind of term to use, but I just kind of use them as a way to kind of like looking at organizations that are not just kind of stuck in doing the same things over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I would say when I say adaptive approaches, I'm thinking specifically about the contractual structure of donor-funded projects, in that it used to be that they were more fixed at the outset of, you must do these 3 activities and achieve these particular outcomes, and you will be judged based on these things. And there's more of a recognition like, well, not all of that is knowable at the outset. You might be missing the big picture if you hold yourself, or you like tie yourself into a straitjacket of like focusing on this thing, when in fact the situation entails shifting, right? So they're trying to be more flexible. I think from a research perspective, it's really interesting because you want to try to still maintain a sense of rigor of like, how do we tell whether something is working or not, beyond just the how do I feel about it, or what do a couple people think or say, and it's not as conducive to the most rigorous approaches that we have available, like randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental designs. It's hard to do in a very short period of time. But there are other kinds of approaches that are emerging and gaining credibility and recognition that can be complementary. I guess that's where I would say.
Right. I want to take this now as a chance. If anybody has a question that they want to ask, if you want to raise your hand or just unmute yourself or put something into the chat, I think it would be, great time now to do that. Well, I'm not seeing anybody that has stepped up yet. So I'm going to ask one kind of final question. So we're going to skip over 7 and just go right to 8. Just overall, what advice would you have for students that are really interested in wanting to work either abroad or within, any company within, or that's an NGO? What piece of advice would you wish you would have known before, or you can think about now?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think I'm sort of 2 minds in answering it. I mean, students are often most interested in the practical, steps of like, how do I enter the workforce? And I have another answer to that, which is more conceptual, but probably won't be as immediately helpful. So I would start with the advice on kind of entering the workforce, and would just go back to, do not be afraid to reach out to people who are working in organizations that you find interesting. They can say they might not respond, but if you have done a little bit of homework about what they do and reach out and tell them very succinctly why you are interested in what they do and would like to learn something, maybe through an informational interview, you should have a couple of quick questions for them, you might be surprised at how many people would respond. And I would also suggest keep track of those people. write down what they say. Maybe ping them later on, say, you know what, the thing you told me a few months ago, I really appreciated. I did this other thing. It's an opportunity for many people who are like mid or more senior in the field to be a mentor. I think people like that, particularly if they have a lot of experience. So if you can put yourself in the position of creating them as your mentor, or putting them in a position of being your mentor and just kind of being a delight to work with, like, that's great. That will work well, and that will do wonders for you in terms of getting into probably any field, not just NGO. And we talked a little bit before about some of the specifics of kind of getting foot in the door, but those, I would just double down on those as like practical things for getting started. Broadly on the big picture one, I would say that's more specific to NGO industry and working abroad is something I reflect on a lot, which is sort of the existential type of question of what is the role of a sort of an international global health or international development researcher coming from a position of privilege, in my case, not from a country where most of the work is being done. What's my value add in this whole system? What do I have to offer? Because it's not just being the one showing up and like answering questions. Like, that's not it. And that was kind of the model of the past. It's not the model of the future. So I think we are, as a society and as a profession, moving more toward a more nuanced and ethical understanding of which players in which part of the system are best positioned to play which kinds of roles. So I would encourage people to think about that, like the local political structure in any organization where these policy changes are being made. It's hard to know about that from the outside. So if you do have an opportunity to go and work someplace and learn about that and see that firsthand, I would recommend doing that. But I wouldn't suggest that you then assume that should be your full-time forever kind of position. It also similarly is helpful to understand a little bit about the kind of bureaucratic processes and kind of the political dynamics within major development organizations that channel hundreds of millions of dollars, like inside Millennium Challenge Corporation, USAID, and then would encourage people to think, with your role as a sort of highly educated, relatively privileged researcher, how can you best be an intermediary kind of between these two ecosystems to help inform decision-making on where the funds go and decision-making on how work is done in both locations, and to find the right counterparts to interact with, kind of across both sides. And I think if we have a lot of people who are orienting themselves with those kind of existential questions and looking to build those kinds of partnerships, that can make the difference between development aid being useful or not being useful, because it's not guaranteed that it's going to be useful.
Yep. No, I think those are great points. And I think it really kind of speaks to the idea of that shift that is going from a one way of doing international development work in the past to this new way, but that it hasn't quite been kind of figured out. And, who and where are the students that are coming from our school or any school, in either doing global health work or international development work, like what is the role that they should kind of have. And maybe some of it is too is students may just have to learn how to kind of define what they think that role is. Like they have to maybe advocate for like, here's what I can bring. And you have to think more broadly in terms of, it's not just, this one thing, but I can do, a multitude of things as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, I want to say thank you for being here today. I really do appreciate the conversation that we had. I want to encourage students also to keep an eye out for our next session that we're having. And also, if you have other questions for us, or if you want to get in touch with Doug, just to please, feel free to reach out to us or connect on LinkedIn or something like that as well. I really did enjoy the conversation. I think it was definitely good to kind of think a little bit more broadly about these things as well. And happy to have you join us here today. Always thank you as an alum for giving back as well. I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation. And yeah, please feel free to reach out for anyone in the session.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.